So welcome to the Node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for May 25th, 2022. We'll follow the agenda as was posted in the issue, which was issue number 1230. Before we get started, does anybody have any announcements they'd like to share? I guess just worth mentioning, OpenJS World is coming up and we have a collaborator summit. I think there's at least 6 or 7 like node specific sessions planned for the collaborator summit so far. So if you're available and able to make it there, keep that in mind as something that could be good to do. I'm also thinking like the collaborator sessions that I'm in, we'll try at least the Zoom, the Zoom link so people can join as well. So don't necessarily have to be there to participate in some of that as well. So moving on, the next section is the CPC and board meeting updates. So Rich, anything on the CPC front?
I missed the meeting this week. Did you go?
I was there. So let me try and remember what we discussed in the CPC meeting. And particular
I didn't see anything
things
on the agenda that leaped out at me.
Yeah, I mean, there was discussion of the code of conduct and like we're planning an update to the code of covenant 2.1, but it's fairly technical. The key thing was just around wording and like the wording, there was concern it might lead to, the cross-project enforcement versus individual project, which is not the intention at all, but that was mostly what the discussion was on. Otherwise, yeah, nothing. I don't think anything else jumps out in mind in terms of things to mention.
Yeah, I'm looking at the agenda right now and I'm not seeing anything.
In terms of the board meeting, just the heads up that typically the board meeting is the third Friday of every month. That's not the case this time because we're doing it live and in person the Monday of the week of OpenJS World. So that will be June 6th, I think, instead of what you might be expecting. And otherwise, I don't have anything on the board front. I'm just going to get out June 6th instead. Of the month as in person. Okay, so we'll move on to the issues that are tagged to the agenda. The first one is revert the change of network interfaces family from string to integer, and there's sort of an issue and a PR related 43054 and 43014. I think the latest on that is, we've discussed it before and there was agreement in a previous meeting to do the revert. There's been some challenges with that revert because tests were failing. The last comment I saw from Antoine was that he had to revert it to the behavior of 17, which is, I think if you pass in IPv4 or IPv6, it ends up being 0. And I just looked at this not too long ago, so I didn't quite understand the implication of that. I don't know if anybody else has looked at it more carefully and does understand what that means or not. This is the particular comment if anybody wants to take a quick look. Where's the chat? Here we go. Says, for some reason, interpreting IPv4, I think the string S4 and IPv6, the string as the number 6, was not working on some hosts. So now it's interpreted as 0, as was the case in node 17 and below. Obviously, that's far from ideal, but it seems to be the only way I could find to revert the change on node.net and have all the tests pass.
Yeah, I think the issue might be that the tests are not fully resilient on all of our CI setup. So with the old behavior with the strings, when it was coerced to 0, you would effectively be running in an IPv4 only mode. So the tests that were trying to do things with network interfaces were always then picking up IPv4 interfaces. With what Antoine was originally doing, which was to theoretically correctly have IPv6 mean IPv6, we were then finding tests were failing on systems because they were now running on network interfaces that they weren't running on before. Whether that's because the tests are, making incorrect assumptions about it. So IPv6 is not just IPv4 with different addresses. IPv6 has other differences and changes, and especially for things like when you're doing network interfaces, there are differences in terms of things like broadcasting or even whether you're allowed to connect to like the wildcard address. So because the tests. So yeah,
that might have been me. Oh,
sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I think in short, going back to that 0 is odd on the surface, but it is consistent with the behavior we had before. So it's kind of resetting us back to the behavior in node 17, even if that behavior is probably not technically correct. But maybe we do that and then sort of look at it, maybe fixing the actual behavior later on. But the issue is that we haven't been able to get a clean CI run without going fully back with that revert.
What I didn't understand was, would some of our existing tests actually be passing in IPv4, the string?
I can't remember how it gets them, because the test pass addresses between like the server being created and the client, so that the client connects to the server, and it's getting values out of that. So I think it is getting IPv6 if the server thinks it's got an IPv6 address.
Okay, maybe I'll because as I understand it, just, we used to take just the number. Which way did we go before? We from string to integer. So we used to take.
So I believe I understood the issue here, because as far as I see it, it's actually a different change in between. And the DNS lookup became a little bit different. I'm not certain, but it does not do any coercion anymore. And if you do a coercion with like any string, and then do a binary shift by 0, you will receive 0. And that could have been the piece that was in there, like it didn't matter if you had IP version 4 or 6 before, because that string would always be coerced to 0 when it was not a number. We would create a deprecation warning, but that's it.
And what does 0 mean?
A 0 is, it'll, I believe it is choosing the first one, which is returned by the network. I'm not certain anymore. I have to look it up on my own.
Okay. So like 4 could say I want 4, 6 could say I want 6, and 0 might be just whatever the default is or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. So this, in theory, I mean, I guess the question is, his fundamental question is like, okay, yeah, we agreed to revert. Are we okay if we revert with this particular behavior?
It is probably broken, so our tests are probably wrong in this case, and it was just not like, maybe even that the tests were written explicitly wrong because of the former behavior that was not noticed.
But it might make sense to revert back and then, because I think we wanted to get that revert sooner than later, and then actually, yeah, okay, let's fix the test along with whatever really needs to be fixed.
I agree.
Okay. So, are we, do we think we understand this well enough to just answer Antoine and say, yes, we think, that's good, or people need more time to look at it? What do we think is the right answer to that question?
Part of me thinks we just need more eyes on it. As many people as we can to go in and weigh up.
Okay, so it's worth taking a bit more time versus just saying, sure, right? So maybe the ask to the TSC is, if people can take a look and then comment. Does that make sense? Okay, I guess if there's no other questions on that front. We can move on to the next issue, which is tools, add, get, blame, ignore revs. So this is 43017. Let's see who it was added by. Was added to the agenda by Darshan. I don't know if anybody else is kind of up to date on the discussion in there, has comments or thoughts. My sort of quick read through was, we can reduce the churn you see if you do a get blame by omitting some commits. And that's what's being suggested, but then there's some opposition in terms of saying, well, hiding things really isn't useful. And the commits are the ones that would be hidden, are like ones that are mostly like, hey, you've added commas or something, like something formatting, that kind of stuff. I see, Ruben, you have some thoughts.
Well, I mean, git blame is sometimes there for also like comparing a specific version with a different version. And yes, sometimes there's something that you want to hide, but sometimes you explicitly want to know everything that has happened in between. If we just skip some specific changes, and then they could be confusing because you were maybe like looking at one version and then the other and pretty much miss what has happened in between that caused this change. Yes, they are just probably trivial changes, but I personally always like to have 100% of what has actually happened and not skipping anything. We have to go through multiple blame steps anyway, pretty much when we want to check for things. So having these big ones in between is something that we stumble upon with former commits anyway, and I don't really think that we benefit a lot from it at the moment. That's my personal take on it, without like having a really strong opinion. Like if everyone else says this is super important, well then let's go for it. I personally don't really see a point in doing it, but more of maybe having a confusing situation at some point, maybe with some edge case that you're looking at.
I kind of share similar sentiment to Ruben. Like I often take a look in the blame when backporting and things for release lines, and for something to be missing, I can imagine I will trip over that at some point. And I think this only applies to the GitHub UI. Is that correct? When using blame in the GitHub UI,
I think that was one of the comments.
I wasn't sure if there was maybe some command line to Git to use that as well.
Yeah, but yeah, still I do use the GitHub UI, but that's just one workflow and I wouldn't want to hold it up for that. There was another comment in here that made me think, which was would this give the green light to massive code churns? And the answer, Like, I hope not, because that can cause other challenges, not just with Git blame.
So from, I'm kind of guessing you're probably coming from a similar point from my point of view. With as a releaser, the problem with changes that have massive churn isn't the blame. The blame is kind of incidental. It's the fact that the churn is causing differences between what's on the sort of development branches versus what's in the release branches, and it sort of makes backporting or cherry picking commits between releases incredibly hard. So, you know, the main objection to churn isn't that, oh, it makes it harder to blame, or, you know, blame keeps fingering this particular commit. It's the code base is fundamentally different.
And
I mean,
really the backports, right?
Yeah, but that, I mean, that's going off on a tangent. But in terms of that particular comment about, does that give the green light to changes that introduce massive churn? No, it does not. At least not from my point of view. You know, I will object to changes that introduce massive churn unless it's demonstratively, you know, that the sort of inconvenience of the huge churn outweighs the pain it's going to cause for managing releases.
Yeah.
But in terms of this particular thing, I'm in a similar sort of, I don't really see the point, but I don't feel strongly enough to object to it offhand.
Any other thoughts, comments on this? I think maybe we can, you know, leave on the agenda until, you know, we have a meeting where Darshan is in attendance since he added it. But it sounds like nobody's like enthusiastically saying, yeah, we should go ahead and do this, right? Okay, unless there's any other thoughts, we can move on to the next issue. Next one, auto closing old stale PRs 42981. Actually, we discussed this last week and there were no objections, so I should have removed from the agenda. So I've done that now, and you know, when I get time to take a look at it, it's something I'll try and move forward. The next one, global fetch break source map 42638. That one, I think last time we discussed and we were hoping to defer until Mateo was in attendance. Since he'd added to the agenda, I know he's sick this week, so I'm not sure we need to block on Mateo. Like, I think the fundamental question is, you know, globals, when we add something to a global, that's got the potential to clobber polyfills, and, you know, we may run into the same problem. And our fundamental decision is, you know, do we stay consistent and make what's global in the browser global, or do we avoid that and put it non-global? And, you know, what do we think is the right answer in these cases? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or opinions on that.
Yeah, don't we typically add things as a sort of experimental? You don't get it unless you turn the flag on, and then like in the next major or subsequent major, sort of make it on by default, which is kind of what happened here, except the for the fetch, it was a very short window between it going into node 17 and then node 18 coming out, where the default was flipped to being enabled. So
right.
maybe there just wasn't enough time. Well, I don't know, because it's sounding like part of the problem with this particular module isn't actively maintained, or it was questionable whether it was being actively maintained, yet was reasonably sort of popular in terms of use. But I think typically for globals, we would normally have it in a current release, and then like the next major would then make it visible by default, you know, visible without a flag, And I think that's what we did. It's just it wasn't a particularly long turnaround between the Node 17 release with fetch and then Node 18 came out very shortly afterwards.
Yeah, it was a pretty small window, I think.
So I don't really know. I mean, if the goal is for the interoperability, unless you're going to put the interoperability in general behind a flag, which I don't think anyone's suggested so far. I'm not sure what else we would be doing other than sort of, introducing things slowly. And
I think the other suggestion is it doesn't have to be global. Like if you actually had to say require fetch or import fetch, then we wouldn't have run into this problem.
I'd have to defer to other people more knowledgeable about.
I think the argument against that is like you don't have to do that in the browser, so it should just be there, right? So it's kind of like it's the consistency with the browser environment versus the problem of, potentially clobbering something that's already there. It sounds like we don't have anybody with like super strong opinion, so let's leave on the agenda to get opinions. Some more people, so maybe we can, talk about it again next time, but at least in my understanding, it's sort of our decision is like, well, would we consider not making it a global because of this issue? Or if it's global in the browser, it should be global. And that's, yeah, it's back then to what Richard said, like we just flipped the switch too quickly this time, right? So and think about that, talk about it more next time, unless anybody else has any additional comments. Okay, so the next one is rename default branch from master domain. We did talk about this last time. There were no objections to proceeding. Obviously, some concern slash I don't know what you would call it. Where we know there's some risk here, but we know we need to proceed. So the next step really is just to plan to do the rename to node repo. So myself and Richard will figure that out, and we'll do that. I'm not sure that'll be immediately. It might be after OpenJS World or whatever, but we'll figure out when we think there's a good time. So unless somebody else wants to add something to that, I don't think there's anything to discuss on that one.
No, I think, I can't see it being before OpenJS World because I think we need to communicate when we're going to do it way in advance of actually doing it.
Yeah.
Just to give people some heads up, and it's going to break somebody who hasn't been paying attention when we do it. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think we'll just pick a date, probably up, like you said, sometime after that. Then we could start a little bit of messaging and do that.
Yeah, even knowing about it, and we did the build repo, and I know we did the build repo because I did it, and I'm still occasionally logging into environments and forgetting that I haven't updated them, and finding the upstreams aren't picking up changes. So I can quite easily see it, but
yeah,
that it is what it is.
Yep. Okay, the next one, process, add CLI. Actually, on that one, I'm gonna open it up because we're getting down to a pretty small set of ones. So we've got node JIP. I think we can look at separately, but the other one is I18N. And I've been trying to ping people there with no luck. And I'm not, so the comment is that like Crowdin is somehow linked to that. And if we rename it, it's going to mess up Crowdin, but I can't seem to find anybody who is active or is, knows anything about crowd-in. I looked in our secrets, and I don't know, Richard, if you've seen it somewhere that I missed, but like I couldn't find info for how we would like log into crowd-in.
I think crowd-in is dormant, let's say, for Node.js. I don't think, I think I18N is also like the internationalization part, not the ICU part, but the like, let's, get translations thing is also like, has also withered and died. It was a valiant effort. At this point, all of our translations are done via direct pull requests to the nodejs.org repository, which I think is appropriate. I would love for crowd-in integration, but I don't think it's being used. And yeah, I don't know if that helps. Anyway, you were asking Richard, not me, so I'll let Richard.
Well, yeah, no, that's exactly where I'm kind of going, is like I'm leaning towards the, I've commented saying, hey,
yank it and CEO complains.
it's March 10th. I'd be like, hey, people who I think might be involved, could you help? And like, there's no answer. And then somebody else 23 days ago, and then some other people 2 weeks ago. I'm trending towards the, what does the TSC feel like if I just change it and it may break crowd-in, and if somebody's interested, we can then fix it.
I like that approach myself.
Anybody have any objections to that approach?
As far as I know, I don't think anyone in the TSCs really had much interaction with those teams or crowd-in at all. I mean, it was all done, I guess, under the old ComCom as part of the sort of how like the website was managed and translated and everything. So it's had no involvement from build. So that there won't be anything in secrets about it, because it wasn't the build initiative, it wasn't the TSC initiative.
Right.
So I don't even know who has the keys, to the crowd-in.
Yeah, I tried to kind of ping the people who I thought might have, but I know they're, haven't been able to be active lately.
I think I think we've arrived at a decision on this.
Yeah. So basically, that's where I was leaning, and I'm just looking for a little bit more support in terms of like, yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. And if people scream, I'll say I at least asked. And okay. So sounds good. So I'm going to just take a note to cover me there. Michael asked about rename HME and maybe credit, but not been able to contact. No objections. Actions from TC for Michael. So just go ahead and do it. Okay, thank you. So yeah, we can move on to the next one then, which is process add ply opt to hide experimental warnings. So this is number 31,000. I went to look to see who added it and realized I added it. So the reason I did that was the discussion seems to have kind of stalled out. And, so, there's been some discussion, and, the complaint is, especially in some of your dependent things, you can get a lot of the experimental warning things. And, and it can be quite annoying / challenging if, and it's something you can't turn off. The other flip side is, there's some people saying, well, there's objections to an option which would turn them all off, because of course we don't want people to not know that they're using experimental things. So for example, there's one comment that would be like, it would be a preference to say, you can only disable individual warnings versus all of them, and that you wouldn't be able to use them in node options. So I think that, the reason I added it to the agenda was to see if we can get an opinion from the TSC that says, would we be, receptive to an option that, I think my question would be, would we be receptive to an option that disables individual experimental warnings and have it be usable in node options? And if not, what are there any other variants that we would found better?
I mean, the argument for allowing it in node options is the warnings may be coming from dependencies that you have no direct control over. So I can understand people wanting to perhaps turn them off if they if they for things that they're using, but they can't influence in terms of what it's actually doing under the covers. I would favor if there was a mechanism for doing individuals over a blanket. Is there not already? There is already an option, isn't there, to turn off all warnings? I mean, it's an all or nothing thing, I thought. I'd have to look at CLI.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that in a particular case.
I think it wasn't just warnings. I feel like turned off. No, sorry, I think it was all warnings, so not just the experimental ones. It just was a binary on or off. Could be wrong, but yeah, I do think if you could turn off individual ones. What I don't know is, I know, for example, we have deprecation codes for deprecations, but I don't think, or at least I'm not aware that we've got codes on individual warnings.
There's some discussion that makes me hope we do. Like I see, like one of the examples there says like node 2159 experimental warning.
That's the process ID.
Okay, so there's some confusion because then it would be like ignore warning 2000 was right. So okay.
Yeah, at least I'm pretty certain that's the process ID and not a identifier of a warning. Sorry, of an experimental warning. But yes, if it was an ID, it would be ideal. But
so ignoring that, like it sounds like you'd be okay with disabling individual experimental warnings and enabled in node options.
Yes, I think I would. And if the worry is that people can slip things into node options, well, I mean, on one hand, you should have control over your environment, and then on the other hand, and the other, we have tooling, we have things like report that will dump out the environment variables that are in use in the process. So I'm not overly concerned about adding things to be allowed. So the things I would prefer not to have in node options would be things that we consider dangerous, and I don't consider consciously squelching an experimental warning.
If it's an individual one,
yeah,
like that's where like I get I'm also like just turning them all on is not something I'd want to make too easy, or sorry, off too easy, but like the individual one seems like a reasonable compromise. And then I can't see that excluding from node options actually helps. It just makes it harder. And yeah, so I think I'm on the same wavelength as what you've outlined there. Anybody else have any thoughts on this front? I guess like if that was the proposal, would anybody here object to that proposal and say no, we don't want to do that? So maybe I'll add into the issue. We discussed in the TSC meeting today. I'm going to put in brackets. We only had 6 people. So, a smallish subset. From the discussion, there would be no objection from the group, from those who were there, if there was an option, if there was an option to disable specific experimental warnings, and that was also supported in node options. Is that fair? Everybody happy if I add that as a comment to possibly get this moving again?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I will paste that and maybe we'll leave it on the agenda one more week to see if, if there's further discussion, maybe get a few more opinions next time. Okay, thanks. Oops, let me just add that to the minutes as well. I just need to reformat that. Okay. That moves us on to the next one, which is end of life dates for Node 16 and OpenSSL 1.1.1 do not align, number 12222. Richard, I know you were looking at that, so if you want to bring us up to date.
Yeah, I need to update the issue. I've spent the last week looking at so I had a suggestion was put to me last week about could we take OpenSSL updates from the Central Stream 8 project or basically upstream RHEL 8 because Red Hat maintain OpenSSL for RHEL 8. So I sort of spent the last week looking at that, and while it's technically possible to do it, it's a little bit more involved than I thought it would be. So it's not as easy as the current OpenSSL update process that we've got with the quick fork. But the main sort of conclusion was that there are very visible differences between the OpenSSL code that Red Hat maintain versus the sort of upstream OpenSSL that we're currently using in, or sort of the fork of the upstream OpenSSL that we're currently using in Node 16. So it's not really something I think I'd be comfortable recommending we do. Because it's such a visible, one of the things it does, that's done, for example, is some of the algorithms are removed from the OpenSSL code that's in CentOS Stream 8. So, for example, the list of available cryptographic curves is much less in that sort of version of OpenSSL than what we've currently got. So, if we're going to end up in that scenario where effectively there are breaking changes anyway, then I much prefer that we went to OpenSSL 3, and I'm not really in favor of doing that either, given that we know that that's causing compatibility issues already. So yeah, I sort of had a look at it, explored it. I kind of feel that we can rule it out. So yeah, I think we sort of go ahead and make, I guess I can try and put some words together and PR it up into the website, and then we can sort of review that, get that out there, and just sort of put the message out, I guess. I'm open, if people come along later on and say, hey, how about we do this, or maybe some of the compatibility issues with OpenSSL 3 could be worked out. But where we are right now, I think the sensible course is to just go ahead and shorten that date. It is unfortunate. I know I've had some people come up to me and say, well, what's the point of having LTS dates if you don't stick to them? But I think we're being forced in this situation, and I'd rather do that than put people in a vulnerable position by making people think they're more secure than they actually are.
And I'd rather announce that we're shortening it now rather than waiting, a year and then announcing it, like give people absolutely the maximum. And then if something comes up, something happens such that we can in fact extend the life to the original end date, great, but it's probably not. And so let's just tell people now and not delay this needlessly.
Yep. So that's what I've taken in the minutes is like, based on the investigation, it's unfortunately more complicated and there's visible differences. So it's based on that, it's really can't be recommended as an alternative source. And we've had no objections to shortening in the issue. We've agreed that we can move forward on that. And that if somebody came forward with a good alternative support, like if somebody came to us and said, hey, we'll support OpenSSL for you for that 7 months, and they made it, they were credible, we'd probably say, okay, great, we can extend the lifespan. But in absence of that, we can't commit to maintain OpenSSL, right? Like that, the project just doesn't have resources to do that. And so the sooner, as Rich says, the best we can do is communicate early and broadly.
All right. Let's do it.
Okay, so Richard, were you volunteering to PR in the?
Yeah, I'll try and get
change?
some. I'll try and get some words together.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks for taking the time to investigate that. If it had panned out, might have been a good thing, but so it's worth exploring and shows that we're looking at our options, but we need to.
Yeah, we
do it
want
right.
to exhaust all possibilities.
Yeah,
all reasonable possibilities, of course. So thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for that update and all the work there. We'll move on to the next one. TC chair election. So basically, the election's concluded. I was reelected as chair, Matteo is co-chair, so I don't think there's anything further to discuss on that one until next year. Okay, the last thing we have on the agenda is strategic initiatives. I think next 10 is the only one we have somebody here to talk to. I don't really have an update on that other than the reminder that our next deep dives are at OpenJS World, and they're on ESM and on observability. And what we need to do between now and then is just make sure anybody we think that it would be good to have in that conversation or be interested in those conversations are aware and hopefully participate either locally or virtually. We've started some of that in the issue, but if anybody has some other ideas of who might be interested, let them know or let us know so we can contact them.
A related question there.
Yeah.
I know virtual participation is the aim. Do you know what that's going to look like yet? Are we going to be using the Node Zoom? Or just
I think it's going to be informal. Like, I don't know that the collaborator summit, I haven't heard anything, some planning for that. What I had in mind is, somebody who's there, we can open up a Zoom. In terms of what Zoom, what link, I haven't really thought about that. Worst case, I think what I was waiting to do is to wait to look at the schedule to see how much overlap there is. If there's not that much overlap, I think we can just, create a Zoom link that we'll use for all of them. I don't know if you have any other thoughts or ideas or suggestions on that front. I'm basically open to anything.
Yeah, I think there's that spreadsheet. So if at some point we could get to the point we have links in there, I'm sure it would be useful for folks joining virtually. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know when the plan was to finalize that. Maybe by the end of this week, I'll take another look and if it doesn't look like, if it looks like one is, then it's pretty simple. If it's more than one, then I'm not quite as sure what we do, but let's hope for the simple case. And that takes us to the end of the agenda. Any other things we should talk about or before we close out? If not, thanks for everybody's time, and thanks to everybody who watches the Zoom, the YouTube live or afterwards, and we'll see everybody in GitHub and next time.